Missouri, 1861. The map makers at the time colored this stretch of land in broad strokes of blue and gray. Yet on the ground, the truth was muddier, blood-soaked, and often indistinguishable. This was a borderland where Union proclamations and Confederate sympathies collided in the fields, where neighbor eyed neighbor not with courtesy, but with suspicion. In that volatile soil, prosperity grew quickly for those bold or ruthless enough to claim it. And no name was more firmly rooted in both prosperity and fear than the Hollis family. Travelers arriving on horseback along the river road were often struck by the Hollis estate. The wide, clapboard house stood on a gentle rise, with white painted columns that gleamed in sunlight, and fields that seemed to stretch to the horizon. To an outsider, it was the picture of industrious success, a beacon of order in a county torn between loyalties. But for those who lived within earshot of its creaking barns and smoke-stained chimneys, the name carried a different weight. Hollis meant power, debt, and a kind of quiet threat that hovered just beneath the surface of polite greetings. The Hollis patriarch, Elias, was a man celebrated in county ledgers as a benefactor. His donations to the militia fund, his role in supplying grain to both Union commissaries and local parishes, his insistence on church attendance, yet whispered in taverns, and at quilting bees were stories that contradicted this public face. Laborers who came to work his land sometimes failed to return home. Tenants who fell behind on payments were said to have left abruptly, though no one received letters afterward. Every missing person was explained away with practiced ease, yet unease clung to these accounts like the Missouri mud after a storm. It was a contradiction impossible to ignore. Fields blooming with abundance while families mourned in silence. Civic generosity paraded in daylight while unanswered questions haunted the night. Neighbors debated whether such tales were the idle talk of jealousy. After all, not everyone could claim the success Elias had built, or whether they hinted at something buried much deeper. In an era where record-keeping was sparse and law officers often beholden to local wealth, suspicion could vanish as swiftly as a name scratched from a ledger. And yet the claim stands, preserved in fragments of testimony and the faint lines of court documents. No family in that county wielded such influence, and none was more feared. The prosperity of the Hollis name was not only built in broad daylight with barns, markets, and land deeds, but, so many would later allege, on hollow graves, dug quietly beneath the very soil that made them rich. What follows is a reconstruction, pieced together from fragmentary ledgers, scattered testimony, and the brittle pages of church minutes that somehow survived fires and floods. Some elements must, by necessity, be dramatized, spoken in voices we cannot fully recover, drawn from absences in the record as much as from the facts that remain. This is not invention for spectacle. It is an attempt to breathe life back into those whose names were silenced, while acknowledging that some details can never be proven with absolute certainty. It is important to note at the outset that the story of the Hollis estate intersects with the harsh realities of enslavement, forced labor, and wartime violence. Accounts describe coercion, disappearances, and the suffering of individuals who had little power to defend themselves. These descriptions will not linger on cruelty for its own sake, but they cannot ignore it either. To do so would be to participate in the same silence that shielded the Hollis name for generations. For viewers who carry personal connections to such histories, please consider this a caution. What follows may disturb, not because it is exaggerated, but because it is close to the truth. The archival method has limits, and so does memory. Court filings use cold phrases like debtor fled east or worker released without payment. Church records reduce lives to brief notes about disruption or impropriety. These scraps are poor, vessels for human grief, yet they are all that official history often left behind. Our task here is to assemble them, carefully and transparently, without pretending certainty where there is none. Every assertion will be anchored to a source when possible. Where silence yawns too wide, we will mark it as silence, not as fact. Even in presenting these shadows, there is a responsibility to the living audience gathered here. You who listen tonight do so not only as consumers of a grim story, but as inheritors of choices made generations ago. The questions raised about power, silence, and complicity remain relevant long after the Hollis barns have rotted and their family lines dissolved. This is not simply a tale of one Missouri estate in 1861. It is an examination of how communities decide what truths to preserve and what truths to bury. And before we go further, a small invitation. Where are you listening from tonight? A farmhouse kitchen, a city apartment, a quiet car ride? Share it if you wish. These stories, though rooted in a specific time and soil, belong to a wider conversation, one in which your presence matters. The year was 1861, and Missouri stood at a jagged crossroads. The newspapers carried conflicting banners, some pledging loyalty to the Union, others proclaiming secessionist sympathies, and in the countryside, those divisions were lived daily, sharpened into fear. Along the Missouri River, one could pass from a farm where sons drilled in Union blue to another where brothers whispered allegiance to the Confederacy, the two separated by nothing more than a fence line. This was not a clean fracture. It was a tangle of loyalties, debts, and ambitions. Neighbors who once borrowed seed from one another now eyed each other as potential traitors. Geography deepened the tension. Missouri's fertile valleys and navigable rivers made it indispensable to both sides. Whoever controlled its fields controlled a portion of the breadbasket that could feed armies. Whoever commanded its waterways held routes of trade and supply. In towns, merchants quietly profited from selling to both Union and Confederate buyers. Farmers, caught between competing patrols, sometimes found themselves extorted by both. The law could not settle on a single face, as sheriffs and judges were often as divided as the people they served. In such uncertainty, influence, especially wealth, became the truest currency. Into this climate, the Hollis family thrived. Their estate sat squarely within the border county, where land disputes were common and property lines blurred by old claims and vague surveys. The Hollises were known for settling those disputes decisively, through purchases when possible, through pressure when necessary. By 1861, they held more than 2,000 acres, a vast expanse that stretched across river bottom and woodland. To many, that scale of ownership signified stability, a bulwark against the chaos of the war. Yet to others, it signified a grip too tight, a power grown unnatural in a land where most families scraped by on smaller holdings. Society itself was warped by this imbalance. Tenant farmers who relied on Hollis land feared default, for debt could mean loss of tools, livestock. Even children pressed into labor until accounts were balanced. Church elders accepted Hollis tithes while quietly ignoring complaints from congregants who whispered of unfair practices. In county meetings, Elias Hollis spoke loudly of duty, order, and loyalty to Missouri's prosperity. His voice carried weight not because of truth, but because his grain and coin had already lined the coffers of militia and parish alike. The moral stakes were stark. Though not spoken aloud, the Hollis vision of order was rooted in control, in ensuring dependence while presenting it as generosity. The war made that easier, for crisis has a way of granting unusual latitude to the powerful. Where others worried about which flag would fly, the Hollises worked to ensure that, no matter the victor, their name would remain untouchable. It was in this crucible of divided loyalties, hungry armies, and desperate farmers that the stories of disappearances began to circulate. Against the backdrop of banners and battalions, the quiet vanishing of laborers seemed almost too small to notice. Yet those who did notice began to see a pattern. And in the heart of Missouri's uncertainty, the Hollis estate stood as both sanctuary and snare, a place where prosperity blossomed, but where the soil might conceal more than roots and grain. The Hollis estate announced itself long before a traveler reached its gates. Approaching from the east, the road curved past oak groves and then opened onto fields that seemed endless, ordered in rows that marched with military precision. Wheat and corn rose from the dark soil, the stalks straight and uniform as if they had been commanded into formation. Outbuildings, granaries, stables, smokehouses stood at measured intervals, their timbers painted and mended with care. At the center, atop a low rise, the Hollis house itself loomed, a wide clapboard mansion with whitewashed columns, broad verandas and windows that caught the morning light. To the casual observer, it was a picture of rural achievement, a proof of what diligence and determination could yield even in unsettled times. Guests invited inside often remarked on the contrast between frontier roughness elsewhere in Missouri and the refinement within the Hollis walls. Rugs imported from the east muffled footsteps on polished floors. Books filled shelves in the parlor, sermons, law treatises, even volumes of poetry. And oil lamps glowed with steady, expensive light. Portraits of stern ancestors watched from gilt frames, their expressions grave, as though reminding each generation of the duty to preserve the family's station. Servants moved quietly, often without being acknowledged, carrying trays or tending fires. To the visitor, this spoke of order, discipline, and prosperity. But just beyond the ornamental hedges lay a different landscape. Tenant cabins clustered in low ground near the creek, where smoke from hearth fires drifted upward in crooked lines. These dwellings were rough, hastily constructed, their roofs patched with whatever material could be found. Families there owed rent not only in coin but in labor, working Hollis fields, tending Hollis livestock, repairing Hollis fences. A ledger kept in the estate office tracked every bushel, every hour, every debt. Falling behind meant forfeiting livestock or tools, and sometimes surrendering family members into labor until balances were cleared. To those who lived in these cabins, the Hollis estate was not a symbol of security, but of constant precariousness. Elias Hollis cultivated his reputation carefully. He was known to attend church services each Sunday, his pew polished and reserved. He made conspicuous donations to the county militia and to civic projects, like road repairs. When disputes arose between neighbors, he often offered mediation, presenting himself as a man of fairness and authority. His words carried weight not only because of his wealth, but because people feared what it might mean to oppose him. The sheriff was seen dining at his table more than once. The local magistrate owed Hollis money for seed. In such a web, justice bent quietly toward power. Yet despite this polished exterior, there were whispers carried in kitchens and taverns. Stories of workers who arrived at the estate and did not return home. Rumors of tenants who, after falling behind, were said to have moved east, yet sent no letters. A child claimed to hear cries at night near the granary, only to be hushed by her father who warned her never to repeat it. These tales never reached the pulpit or the courthouse. They lived in the private spaces of the fearful. To speak too loudly was to risk eviction, debt collection, or worse. Thus, the Hollis estate stood in stark contradiction. To the county ledger, it was a pillar of prosperity, a symbol of what order could look like in a land teetering on war. To the common families who worked its fields, it was a place of dependency and dread, where smiles and hospitality masked something hidden beneath the soil. In daylight, it gleamed with the promise of success. Yet in the quiet hours, it whispered with unease. It was this duality, wealth versus human cost, order versus control, that would define the story to come. In the autumn of 1858, when the corn was high and the nights carried the first chill, a man named Robert Fletcher came to the Hollis estate with his family. He was 34 years old, a tenant farmer with calloused hands and little more than a mule, a wagon, and his wife and two small daughters. Records describe him as quiet, diligent, not prone to drink. He signed a lease to cultivate a parcel of bottomland along the creek, a modest acreage that promised a stable yield if the weather held. For a time, by all appearances, life seemed tolerable. He attended Sunday services, traded modestly at the general store, and shared tools with neighbors. His girls played with other children near the cabins. There was nothing remarkable in his presence until the day he disappeared. According to Hollis records, Fletcher's tenancy ended abruptly in November. The estate ledger, still preserved in fragments, shows his account crossed out in a hurried hand. A note, written in the margin by the overseer, reads only, "Returned east. Acre reassigned." That notation, so terse and final, would stand as the sole official record of Fletcher's fate. To the county clerk, it was explanation enough. To the sheriff, it was a closed matter. But to Fletcher's wife, left behind with children in a tenant cabin, it was neither explanation nor closure. She told neighbors in hushed tones that Robert had gone to deliver grain to the Hollis granary late one evening. He never came back. At dawn, she searched the road, then the fields. She claimed she went to the house itself, where Elias Hollis told her Robert had packed his things and left without a word, bound for family in Kentucky. Yet no wagon tracks were seen on the road, no mule was missing, and no letter ever arrived from any kin. When she pressed further, Hollis advised her to mind her duties, and reminded her of the debt still owed on seed. Neighbors remembered her distress vividly. One farmer's wife later recounted, in a church circle, that the widow was white with fear, certain she'd been lied to. Yet no one spoke publicly on her behalf. To accuse Hollis directly was unthinkable. She was left to work her parcel alone until her debts consumed it, at which point she and the children vanished from the record as well. Whether they left the county or were pressed into labor, no one could say. Their names never appear again in census rolls. The silence surrounding Fletcher's disappearance is telling. In a county where gossip traveled quickly about much smaller scandals, the story did not spread beyond a whisper. The sheriff, when asked years later, insisted that Fletcher had gone to seek better prospects, and that his wife followed after. This narrative served the Hollis estate neatly, excusing them from blame while erasing the family's cries for help. The only trace we have comes from that estate ledger. The page is stained, the ink faded, but the crossing out of Fletcher's name is clear. It is accompanied by a symbol, two diagonal slashes that appear beside several other tenant names over the years. Scholars later debated their meaning. Did they mark a voluntary departure, or something more sinister? Without further records, certainty is impossible. But the pattern, once noticed, becomes difficult to ignore. Thus began the first true incident, the seed of suspicion that the Hollis prosperity was rooted in something darker than commerce. A man disappears, a family falls silent, and the soil that fed the county yields no answers. The contrast could not be sharper. Official reports declaring order, while lived grief suggested something was deeply wrong. The contrast here was stark. The very systems meant to protect the vulnerable, law, church, community, were bent to shield the powerful. Each had the chance to speak, and each chose silence. What lingered was not justice, but a chilling realization among the poor of the county. If a man could vanish from the Hollis estate and leave no trace but a line in a ledger, then no one was truly safe. It was the summer of 1860 when the silence finally broke, if only for a brief and perilous moment. The congregation of St. Matthew's, a modest wooden church set back from the main road, gathered as they did each Sunday. The benches were crowded, men and women separated by custom, children fidgeting in the heat while fans stirred the heavy air. The Hollis family occupied their customary place near the front. Elias in a dark coat despite the season, his wife in pale muslin, their children well turned out. Their presence lent the service a kind of gravity. When they bowed their heads, others followed, as though the rhythm of worship itself hinged on their participation. But that morning, a widow named Martha Keene rose to her feet. Her son had worked the Hollis land for several seasons, laboring to clear debts that never seemed to diminish. Neighbors remembered him as a strong young man, known for his willingness to help with repairs and harvests. Yet by midsummer he was gone. Hollis records marked his debt as settled, through service rendered, and Elias himself had told Martha that her son had found work upriver. She knew otherwise. She had not heard from him once, and his belongings had not been taken from the cabin. To her it was clear he had not left of his own accord. Martha's voice trembled as she spoke, but those who sat nearby said the words carried with startling force. She accused the Hollises, not with wild shouting, but with a firm statement. Her son had been taken, and she believed the family bore responsibility. Gasps rose from the pews, and the minister froze mid-sermon. For a moment the fragile veil of deference tore, and the unease many had buried flickered into daylight. Elias did not answer immediately. Instead, the minister hurriedly declared the words an improper disturbance, and urged Martha to sit. Two deacons stepped forward, placing gentle but insistent hands on her shoulders. She tried to continue, insisting that she would not be silenced, that someone must account for her son's fate. Her eyes scanned the room, seeking allies, but found only bowed heads and averted gazes. No one rose to stand beside her. After the service, the incident was spoken of carefully, if at all. The official church minutes still preserved. Note only, disturbance by Sister Keene, correction administered, admonition given, no mention of her accusation, no record of the name of her missing son, only the cold phrasing of impropriety. Within weeks, Martha herself disappeared from the county rolls. Some said she left to live with kin in Illinois. Others whispered she had been forced off Hollis land and vanished along the road. The truth was never confirmed. The episode revealed a deeper fracture than the missing man alone. The church, meant to be sanctuary, had sided with wealth and silence. The community, faced with the chance to unite against injustice, chose self-preservation. The widow's courage lasted minutes. The price she paid endured far longer. And yet the memory of that Sunday lingered. Though the official record buried it under euphemism, those who witnessed her stand could not forget the tremor it sent through the congregation. Faith had clashed with power, and power prevailed. But in the whispers that followed, in kitchens and behind barn doors, the question persisted. How many others had vanished? And how many more would before someone listened? The memory of Martha, Keene's outburst at St. Matthew's, faded quickly in the official sense, erased in minutes, dismissed by the minister, buried in polite conversation. Yet it did not vanish from the minds of those who had sat in the pews that morning. In kitchens, as bread was needed, her words returned. In barns, while tools were mended, men repeated them in hushed tones. Children shooed outside, carried fragments of overheard phrases, taken, not his choice, the Hollis man knows, and whispered them while playing in the fields. Though no one dared speak openly again, suspicion settled like dust on every household that worked Hollis land. The silence of institutions only sharpened the sense of unease. The sheriff had turned away the Fletcher family. The church had silenced Martha Keene. What remained was rumor, half-believed yet persistent. Farmers began to notice patterns, the way certain names disappeared from the estate's ledgers, the way belongings were left behind, the way debts were marked settled without explanation. They told themselves these things could have innocent reasons. War was looming, men left without farewells. Records were never perfect. And yet, when night came and the winds moved through the corn, the explanations felt thin. Among those who listened more carefully was Dr. Alaric Monroe, a physician of 36, newly returned from medical training in St. Louis. He was not a man given to gossip, nor particularly political, but he was observant. He had treated tenant families for fevers, for broken bones, for childbirth complications, and in his practice he began to notice injuries that unsettled him. Men brought in with bruises too consistent to be accidents, women with malnourishment beyond what a good harvest year should allow, children whose stories faltered when asked how they came to be burned or cut. Monroe began keeping a second set of notes, separate from his medical ledger. In careful script, he recorded not only the symptoms but the circumstances, who worked the Hollis land, what debts they owed, when they disappeared. He did not speak of this openly at first, but the accumulation of oddities pricked his conscience. When he overheard mention of Martha Keene's accusation, he added her son's name to his hidden list. In the margins of his notebook, he marked it with a symbol of his own devising, a triangle for unresolved. The neighbors knew of Monroe's diligence. They came to him not only for medicine, but for counsel, testing his reactions with half-phrases. A farmer's wife might mutter, "Strange how John hasn't written." Monroe would nod but not press, careful not to betray what he was gathering. Yet inside his unease grew. He had trained to heal, not to investigate, but he could not ignore the pattern that seemed to be forming beneath the surface of county life. Still, even Monroe hesitated to act. He was bound by the same fears as the others. The Hollis reach was long, and their goodwill or their enmity could mean the difference between survival and ruin. For now, he confined his resistance to ink and paper, trusting that if the truth was too dangerous to speak, at least it might be preserved. And so suspicion took root not in shouts or trials, but in whispers, notebooks, and sidelong glances. It was a strange kind of resistance, quiet, hidden, yet growing. The contrast became sharper with each passing month. Rumor versus silence, evidence versus denial. And at the center of it stood a physician whose conscience was waking, though he did not yet know the dangers that awakening would bring. It was the spring of 1861, when the whispers first spilled into the open in a way that could not be so easily erased. A storm had swept through the county the night before, tearing shingles from roofs and flooding the lower fields. In the morning, as families ventured out to assess the damage, 2 children were found wandering along the river road. They were barefoot, their clothes torn and muddied, their eyes wide with the hollow look of the sleepless. A boy of about 9 clutched the hand of a younger girl, perhaps 6. They gave no names at first, only a repeated phrase, "We got out." The farmer who found them, Jonathan Pike, brought the children into his kitchen, fed them bread and milk, and tried to coax their story. Slowly, in halting words, they said they had been hiding in a cellar. The boy claimed it was under the big barn with the stone floor. He described stairs that led down, and rooms where the air smelled like dirt and rot. He said there were others still down there, men who groaned, a woman who prayed. He insisted they had fled when the storm shook the walls, slipping out through a loose board. Pike's wife later swore she heard the boy whisper the name Hollis when asked where the barn stood. The girl said nothing more than, "Don't send us back." Yet within a day, the sheriff was notified, and by that same evening, the children were escorted not to safety, but back to the Hollis estate itself. Elias Hollis met the sheriff at his gate, thanked him publicly, and explained that the children were orphans under his care, kept in the granary cellar only for their protection during storms. He claimed they were flighty with fear, and had invented stories to make sense of their ordeal. The official record matches his account. A brief line in the sheriff's log notes, 2 vagrant children returned to Hollis estate. No further action required. Their names were not entered, their origins left untraced. From that moment, they disappeared from all rolls, never mentioned again. But among the neighbors, the story did not fade. Pike's wife, shaken, repeated the children's words to her kin. She remembered the girl clutching her arm so tightly it left bruises, begging, "Don't let them find us." Others whispered of hearing faint cries at night drifting from the direction of the Hollis barns, though none dared investigate. For Dr. Monroe, who learned of the episode through a patient, this was the first corroboration of what he had suspected, that the disappearances were not accidents or abandonments, but part of something concealed beneath the soil and stone of the Hollis estate. This was more than rumor now. Innocence stood in contrast with predation. Children too young to invent such detail, pitted against the word of the county's most powerful landowner. The authorities had chosen once again to side with wealth. Yet the image lingered in the minds of those who had glimpsed the children, that of a cellar, of others still trapped, of small voices swallowed by the earth. The incident marked a turning point. For those willing to see, the pattern was undeniable. And for Monroe, it was the moment he began to consider not just recording but acting. Still, the risk was immense. To question Hollis openly was to risk livelihood, or even life. For now, the story of the orphans was buried, as so many others had been. But beneath the quiet of the countryside, a reckoning was gathering. Dr. Alaric Monroe was not a man prone to dramatics. His training in St. Louis had instilled in him a habit of precision, of measuring, documenting, and verifying. Yet after hearing of the two children and their desperate words, something shifted. He could no longer tell himself that the vanishings were merely accidents of war or migration. The pattern had become too sharp, too insistent. And so, he began to write not as a physician only, but as an investigator of sorts, creating a second ledger that he kept hidden beneath a false bottom in his traveling case. In this book, his hand grew tight and deliberate. Each entry was given a number, the names written in full if known, initials if secrecy seemed safer. He recorded dates of disappearance, debts owed to the Hollis estate, and any peculiarities surrounding the case. For Robert Fletcher, he noted, last seen at Hollis Granary, November 1858, wife claims false account. Marked returned east, no evidence. For Martha Keene's son, debt declared settled. Mother's public protest suppressed, both absent from subsequent census. For the children found on the Pike farm, boy describes cellar beneath barn, spoke of others still present. Sheriff returned both, subsequent records absent. What made his notes distinct was the addition of coded marks in the margins. A triangle for unresolved vanishings, a circle for injuries suggestive of coercion, a slash for corroborated testimony. Over time, the pages filled with these symbols, creating a grim mosaic of absence and injury. He wrote as though building a case for a court that might never convene, for jurors who might never be summoned. Monroe also began to notice details others ignored. Laborers he treated bore injuries, deep bruises across the back, wrists abraded, shoulders dislocated, that could not be explained by ordinary farm accidents. When he asked, patients muttered of falls from ladders or slipped harnesses. Yet the wounds suggested restraints, blows, or prolonged strain. One man, feverish and near delirium, whispered that he had been kept too long below before. Monroe's questions were cut short by the arrival of a Hollis overseer. The doctor noted it all, writing in careful Latin shorthand to deter casual readers. Still, he knew the danger. To speak openly would invite retaliation not only from the Hollises but from those who depended on them. So he practiced restraint in public, playing the part of the neutral physician, while his private notebook swelled with testimony that contradicted the county's silence. He even began to sketch rough maps of the estate, marking barns, cellars, and the suspected sites of hidden rooms described by the children. These drawings, smudged with ink and haste, became as precious to him as his medical texts. The contrast was unbearable. By day, Monroe dispensed tonics, stitched wounds, and smiled politely at Hollis' family, gatherings where he was invited as a respected professional. By night, he pored over his hidden ledger, adding each fresh name like a weight upon his conscience. He understood that knowledge alone was not enough, that evidence, to mean anything, would require risk. Yet for the moment, he confined his courage to paper, as though the act of preserving the truth was itself a small defiance. The ledger still exists, though only in fragments. Later archivists found pages torn, margins scorched, as if someone had tried to destroy it. But enough remains to show the hand of a man who saw the pattern clearly and refused to let it slip entirely into silence. In his cautious script, suspicion became evidence. Rumor became record. And the outlines of the Hollis family's hidden history began to take undeniable shape. The spring of 1862 brought a new kind of evidence, fragile, smuggled, and all the more dangerous because of what it implied. Among Dr. Monroe's patients was a girl of 15 named Eliza Carr. Employed in the Hollis household as a seamstress, she came to him complaining of a persistent cough, but beneath her plain dress she carried something far heavier. After a fit of hesitation, and only when the door was barred and the shutters drawn, she slid from her sleeve a folded slip of paper. The parchment was creased from long concealment, the ink faded where it had pressed against her skin. The words were not her own, she explained in a hushed rush. She had found it hidden beneath the mattress of a servant's cot in the estate's lower quarters. The woman who slept there, known only as Ruth, had vanished the previous winter without notice, her belongings packed away by overseers. Eliza had kept the paper hidden since, uncertain what it meant, fearing to burn it, yet terrified to be caught with it. Now her cough had given her a pretext to visit Monroe, and she dared to pass it on. The letter was brief. written in a tight and hurried hand. If this is found, know we are not free to leave. They keep us below when we are too weak, saying it is for debt. Some do not return. I hear the earth groan at night. Tell anyone who will listen. The Hollis kindness is a mask. We are buried while yet breathing. There was no signature, only a small cross scrawled at the bottom. The phrasing was uneven, part plea, part confession, but its meaning was clear. For Monroe, it was the first written voice from inside the estate confirming what rumor, injury, and the orphan's testimony had suggested. He copied the words into his hidden ledger, then returned the slip to Eliza, advising her to destroy it. She promised she would, though her trembling hands betrayed her fear. That letter changed the texture of Monroe's notes. No longer were they a private collection of suspicions and medical observations. They now included a message from within, a testimony that could not be dismissed as gossip. Yet the letter also deepened the danger. If Ruth had been caught attempting to pass it on, her disappearance was easily explained. And if Eliza were discovered with it, her fate would be sealed as well. The contrast was unbearable. A world of civility and piety above ground, set against a hidden world where people wrote farewell notes as if entombed. The Hollis estate remained a place of summer gatherings, of Sunday appearances, of harvest fairs where Elias Hollis shook hands with neighbors and pledged loyalty to the Union cause. Yet beneath its barns, if the letter was true, human lives were being spent like coin, concealed by soil and silence. Monroe began making careful copies of the letter in Latin script, storing them in different hiding places. He feared discovery, but he also feared loss. That if the paper were destroyed, the truth would vanish with it. He began drafting a coded summary addressed to a colleague in St. Louis, one who had once spoken against abuses in debtors' prisons. The draft was never sent, perhaps because Monroe feared interception. Still, the existence of such drafts shows that he was wrestling with how far to extend his peril. Later, in archives pieced together after the war, fragments of this very letter were found tucked between the pages of Monroe's medical ledger. Its words are still legible, though water-stained, buried while yet breathing. That phrase, more than any rumor, echoed through time as proof that the Hollis name rested not only on wealth but on graves no one had chosen. The summer of 1863 was already restless in Missouri. Skirmishes between Union patrols and Confederate partisans had set neighbor against neighbor, and suspicion hung in the air thicker than the July heat. Against this backdrop, the Hollis estate remained a place of uneasy calm. Its fields were lush, its barns well stocked, and Elias Hollis himself was more visible than ever, attending county meetings, lending supplies to Union officers, even offering public prayers for the safety of Missouri's sons. Yet beneath the veneer of loyalty and benevolence, the whispers had grown unbearable. Too many names had vanished from the tenant rolls. Too many families had spoken of sudden settlements of debt followed by silence. And the memory of the children who cried of cellars had never quite faded. It was in this climate that a group of men, led by Jonathan Pike, the same farmer, who had first sheltered the orphans, resolved to confront what they had long feared. They did not arrive at the decision easily. Some begged caution, warning that without official sanction they would be branded as trespassers or worse. But others argued that waiting on the sheriff or the courts was futile. Both had shown time and again that the Hollis name stood beyond scrutiny. They gathered in Pike's barn one evening, lanterns swinging above their heads, while thunder rolled on the horizon. Among them was Dr. Monroe, pale with hesitation, yet firm in his conviction that the time for secrecy had passed. Their plan was simple. Under the guise of offering aid after a recent skirmish near the river, they would demand entry to Hollis's granary barns, citing the need to check for wounded men possibly hidden there. They carried with them not rifles but lanterns, ropes, and spades, tools that spoke of rescue more than assault. Still, each man knew the risk. To step onto Hollis land unbidden was to invite retaliation from his overseers, and perhaps from Hollis himself. On the evening of July 12th, as dusk deepened and fireflies lit the hedgerows, the group crossed into the estate. The bonds loomed dark against the fading sky, their stone foundations cool and implacable. At the largest of them, the one the boy had described years earlier, they paused. Pike knocked first, his fist echoing against the wood. No answer came. They pushed the doors open, their lantern light spilling across stalls, harnesses, and neatly stacked feed. At first, nothing seemed amiss. The air smelled of grain and dust. Yet beneath that, faint and lingering, was a sour note, the odor of damp earth. They searched, methodical and tense. Monroe pressed his palm against the stone floor, feeling for seams. Another man struck the ground with the butt of his spade, listening for hollows. At last, near the rear wall, they found it. A trapdoor, iron-banded, nearly flush with the stone. It bore a padlock thick and rust-stained. Monroe swore he heard a muffled sound beneath it, though the others dismissed it as wind in the cracks. Still, they set to work. The padlock resisted, but with effort and pry bars they bent it free. The trapdoor groaned as it lifted, sending up a draft of air heavy with mildew and something sharper, something that pricked the nostrils like sickness. Before they could lower their lanterns, a shout rang out. Overseers, armed and furious, burst into the barn. Behind them strode Elias Hollis himself, his cane striking the stones like a drumbeat. His voice was cold, controlled, but laced with threat. He accused them of trespass, of seeking to steal or sabotage. He declared that the trapdoor led only to storage cellars where feed was kept cool and dry. Any further intrusion, he warned, would be met with force. The confrontation teetered on the edge of violence. Pike argued back, pointing to the stench, the locked hatch, the whispers too long ignored. Monroe, trembling but resolute, held up his ledger and declared he had proof of the disappearances, of the injuries, of the letter smuggled from within. Yet in the charged silence that followed, the power of Hollis's name outweighed the weight of his words. More overseers arrived, their hands resting on rifles. The intruders were given a choice: leave the barn and keep their tongues, or be carried out and branded as agitators, perhaps even Confederate sympathizers. One by one, under the weight of Hollis's gaze, the men faltered. They lowered their lanterns, replaced their tools, and backed away. Only Monroe lingered, eyes fixed on the dark opening at their feet, certain he heard the faintest echo of movement below. But when Hollis's cane struck the stone again, the doctor stepped back. The trapdoor was slammed shut, the lock replaced, and the barn sealed behind them. That night, as the group scattered back to their homes, shame mixed with dread. They had come close to truth, had even brushed its edge, but had failed to drag it into daylight. The contrast could not have been sharper, the barn standing serene under the moonlight, while beneath its stones something unseen breathed in darkness. Hollis remained untouchable, and those who dared to challenge him now knew the price of defiance. In the weeks that followed, several of the men who had joined the attempt found themselves burdened with sudden debts or unexplained shortages in their harvests. Pike's fields were struck with blight, though no other farm nearby suffered the same. A message had been sent. The county's institutions closed ranks, and once again the silence deepened. The failed confrontation at the Hollis barns left behind an invisible scar across the community. At first it manifested in silence. Neighbors who had once whispered their suspicions fell quiet when Pike or Monroe approached, eyes darting to doorways as if someone might be listening. What had been fragile solidarity among the wary now fractured into isolation. The lesson was plain: challenge the Hollises directly, and misfortune would follow. And misfortune did. Within weeks, Pike's cornfields blackened under a blight no other farmer reported. His creditors, many tied to Hollis accounts, pressed him with sudden urgency. By September, he had lost a portion of his land, and his family withdrew from public gatherings altogether. Others among the would-be searchers fared little better. One man's barn caught fire under suspicious circumstances. Another was arrested on charges of disloyal speech against the Union, though those who knew him swore he had said no such thing. It was as though an unseen hand had pressed down upon each in turn, punishing their trespass without leaving visible marks. To the outside world, these were coincidences of war and chance. To those who knew better, they were warnings. For Monroe, the retaliation was more subtle, yet more suffocating. Patients from Hollis-affiliated families ceased to call on him. Supplies ordered from St. Louis were delayed or lost. Letters he sent to colleagues went unanswered, though he could not prove they were intercepted. The sheriff, once cordial, if distant, now addressed him with clipped formality, reminding him that a physician's duty was to heal, not to meddle in affairs beyond his training. Even the church seemed to turn colder, its ministers speaking warmly of Hollis' generosity while pointedly omitting Monroe's name from their prayers. His isolation deepened at home as well. Friends advised him to burn his ledger, to put aside the matter for the sake of his livelihood. His own kin worried aloud that his stubbornness would bring ruin upon them all. Yet the doctor could not forget the weight of that trapdoor, nor the smell of air that had risen from below. The memory haunted his sleep, turning nights into long vigils of scratching pen against paper. He copied his notes again and again, hiding them in jars buried beneath fence posts, beneath floorboards, even within the hollow of an old tree. It was as if he feared not just discovery, but erasure, as though the Hollises might somehow wipe the truth itself from existence. In this way, Monroe became both chronicler and exile, a man bound to silence yet unable to accept it. He treated the sick by day, performing his duties with calm precision, but his eyes were ringed with fatigue, and his manner grew distant. He was seen walking alone near the river at odd hours, pausing to write beneath lantern light. Children whispered that he spoke to ghosts, though in truth he was speaking to history, trying to fix in ink what others refused to see. The contrast of his life grew unbearable. Above ground, a county marching forward with crops and sermons, where Hollis stood in public as benefactor and patriot. Beneath the surface, a hidden ledger, coded letters, and the certainty of crimes that no court dared name. Monroe embodied that fracture, respected in title, but steadily stripped of voice. It was during this period of isolation that the last fragments of Ruth's letter, the one smuggled by Eliza Carr, became an obsession for him. He carried them folded in his coat, worn from handling, rereading the line, buried while yet breathing, until the ink blurred. To him, it was no longer just testimony. It was prophecy, a warning that if silence continued, the whole county would one day find itself complicit in the burial of the innocent. Yet even as he clung to evidence, Monroe understood the danger of acting alone. His circle of allies had withered. Those who had once dared to knock on the Hollis barn now avoided his gaze. He stood at the edge of something vast and perilous, with only his notes to keep him company. What had begun as suspicion had become a private war, waged with ink against wealth, secrecy, and fear. And the more he wrote, the clearer it became. Survival was no longer guaranteed, not for him, and not for the truths he carried. By the winter of 1863, the walls had closed in on Dr. Alaric Monroe. His ledger was swollen with names, coded marks, and fragments of testimony. But each day he felt the futility of it. The county would not listen. The sheriff had proven loyal to Hollis. The church had smothered every public outcry. Even his fellow farmers, who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with him in the barn, now averted their eyes. He had written enough to fill a tribunal's docket, yet he lived as though those pages were stones dragging him into a river. What good was truth if it remained locked in his drawer, known only to a man already marked for ruin? It was in this despair that he resolved to reach beyond Missouri, to place the matter before those who might still care. In January, he began drafting a long letter addressed to a reformist lawyer he had known distantly during his training in St. Louis, a man named Ezra Duval, who had once spoken publicly against abuses in debtors' prisons and poorhouses. Monroe wrote with uncharacteristic fervor, abandoning the clinical restraint of his medical notes. He described disappearances, coded his accusations with biblical phrasing, and included excerpts from the smuggled note of Ruth. "We are not free to leave. The Hollis kindness is a mask, buried while yet breathing." But Monroe knew words alone would be doubted. He enclosed copies of his diagrams of the Hollis barns, sketches of where the trapdoor had been found, and even rubbed impressions of the padlock he had pried against. He transcribed testimonies in both English and Latin, hoping at least one version would pass undetected if intercepted. He begged Duval not only to investigate but to preserve the documents should misfortune befall him. Getting the letter out was the greater risk. Mail routes were treacherous in wartime Missouri, often seized by partisans or rifled by opportunists. Worse still, Hollis' influence reached deep into the postal chain. Monroe decided to entrust the package not to postmasters but to a Union quartermaster, passing through the county with supply wagons. The man agreed reluctantly, pocketing the envelope with promises he did not repeat aloud. Monroe watched the wagons depart into the snow, his breath fogging in the cold, unsure if he had just cast his lifeline or signed his own warrant. For weeks he waited, each day more tense than the last. No reply came. Instead came shadows. A rider lingered outside his practice longer than needed. Footsteps passed his windows at odd hours. A warning arrived in the form of a stone hurled through his shutters, bearing no note but needing none. The implication was clear. Someone knew. The county's silence had hardened into vigilance, and Monroe's efforts to pierce it had drawn attention he could not escape. The contrast in his life grew unbearable. On Sundays, he still sat in the pews of St. Matthew's, listening as Elias Hollis was praised for his generosity in supplying wheat to Union camps. By night, he sat hunched over his desk, convinced that the ledger before him was now a death sentence. He carried it from room to room like a talisman, unable to part with it yet knowing that every page increased his peril. Whether the letter to Duval ever reached St. Louis remains uncertain. No reply was preserved, no formal petition entered. Some later accounts suggest the lawyer was threatened into silence. Others believe the envelope was intercepted long before. What is undeniable is this. By February of 1864, Monroe himself was gone. His house was found abandoned, his instruments scattered, his ledger missing. Neighbors recalled seeing his lantern burning late one night, and then never again. The choice to reach outward, his final act of defiance, had been both necessary and fatal. It broke the closed circle of silence, but at the cost of his own disappearance. And in this, Monroe joined the very pattern he had so carefully documented. Another name struck from the rolls. Another debt settled. Another voice buried with the others. In the months that followed Dr. Monroe's disappearance, the Hollis family did not retreat from view. They stepped forward with renewed vigor, as though determined to blot out even the memory of dissent. The county was restless. War had emptied fields of young men. Prices fluctuated wildly, and loyalties split neighbor from neighbor. Yet the Hollises seemed immune to the chaos. Elias Hollis organized public gatherings on his lawn, offering barrels of flour to soldiers, widows, and boasting of donations to Union supply drives. He wrote letters to local newspapers, praising the county's resilience and affirming his lifelong commitment to the common good. In print, he appeared as the model citizen, a patriarch balancing generosity with patriotism. It was during this period that the story of Monroe's vanishing was quietly reshaped. The official line, whispered by clerks and echoed by ministers, was that he had left of his own accord, traveling east to avoid the dangers of bushwhackers and guerrilla raids. A rumor spread that he had debts in St. Louis, debts so severe that his absence was less disappearance than escape. The sheriff, when pressed, remarked only that Monroe had closed his practice without notice. No investigation was opened, no belongings catalogued. His name was erased as though it had never carried weight in the county at all. The contrast could not have been sharper. On one hand, public celebration of Hollis virtue. On the other, the quiet burial of Monroe's life and work. Families who had once confided their fears to him now spoke only of the doctor's unreliability, their voices carrying the rehearsed tone of those who had been warned. Those who might have mourned him aloud did so in whispers, behind closed doors, fearing that grief itself might be interpreted as dissent. Meanwhile, the Hollis barns continued to loom. More tenants disappeared, though their names never reached ledgers. Fields once leased to struggling farmers were absorbed back into the estate, increasing its size. Overseers patrolled with greater frequency, their presence explained as precaution against raiders. Yet, those who lived nearby swore the patrols were as much to keep people in as to keep enemies out. The estate became both sanctuary and prison, a place of abundance in wartime scarcity, but one that carried an undertone of dread too dangerous to name. Artifacts from this period reinforce the duality. A broadside preserved in county archives lists Elias Hollis, a sculptor among the county's largest donors to a Union hospital fund. Yet in the same folder lies a crumpled slip of paper, unsigned, in a different hand. Tell me where Monroe went, and I will tell you what lies beneath. No one knows how that note entered the record, though its presence suggests that not all were convinced by Hollis's performance. By late 1864, the Hollises had woven themselves so thoroughly into the county's institutions that to question them was to question the very fabric of loyalty in wartime Missouri. To call their name into doubt was to invite accusations of treachery, of sympathy for the enemy. And so silence hardened into permanence. The ledger was gone, the doctor erased, and the Hollis barn stood unchallenged, stone floors concealing whatever lay beneath. It was a triumph of appearances over truth, of reputation over evidence. Yet beneath that triumph lingered a current of unease, unspoken but palpable. Those who remembered the children, the trapdoor, the doctor's pale face as he insisted on his notes, carried the knowledge like a secret wound. The county had chosen survival over justice, and in doing so, it had bound itself ever tighter to the Hollis name. The war's end in 1865 brought with it a fragile hope that old silences might finally crack. Union victory had unseated many of Missouri's entrenched powers, and federal agents fanned out across the state to investigate claims of corruption, profiteering, and wartime abuses. For a brief season, the Hollis name seemed vulnerable. Soldiers who had marched past the estate during campaigns recalled its barns and spoke in low tones of the armed overseers, the locked doors, the strange absence of familiar tenant families. Widows of the missing found new courage, encouraged by rumors that the government was willing to listen where local sheriffs had refused. Into this atmosphere came the first petitions. The Fletcher family, long ignored, submitted a sworn statement declaring Robert had never left for the East but had vanished after working on Hollis land. Others added their names. Pike, though still ruined, affirmed under oath that 2 orphans had once told him of a cellar filled with captives, and a young woman, Eliza Carr, older now, weary from years of service, repeated her story of the smuggled letter, though she no longer had the slip to prove it. For a brief moment, it seemed as though justice might stir. Federal investigators summoned Elias Hollis to Jefferson City, where he sat in a grand chamber, answering questions with polished ease. He produced ledgers showing debts paid, names crossed out with neat notations of resettled east or released from service. He presented receipts of donations to the Union cause, letters of commendation from officers who had relied on his grain. When pressed about the orphans, he claimed they had been sent to kin in Arkansas. When asked about Monroe, he smiled sadly and suggested the doctor had been troubled in mind, prone to melancholy, and had likely sought a quieter life elsewhere. What the investigators lacked was Monroe's ledger. Without it, the testimonies of widows and farmers were dismissed as grief, bitterness, or rumor. The Fletchers were told no body had been produced. Pike's account was undermined by his own financial ruin. Eliza Carr was dismissed as a servant girl of questionable reliability. The Hollis papers, by contrast, were tidy, authoritative, and bound with the weight of wealth. Within months, the petitions were closed. Records of the hearings were sealed, stored in county archives under the notation, unsubstantiated allegations. No further inquiry was made. The official story became the only story, that the Hollis estate had been a pillar of loyalty during the war, a place of order in chaos, a benefactor to both army and neighbor. The darker whispers were erased not by denial, but by paperwork stamped with government seals. The contrast was devastating. Families who had hoped for justice now lived under a heavier silence than before, their grief formally invalidated by the same institutions they had trusted. The truth had not merely been ignored, it had been entombed, buried beneath stamped pages and locked drawers. In time, even their children would grow hesitant to speak of what had once seemed certain, fearing they would be mocked as dreamers or agitators. Artifacts from this brief moment of hope still linger, tucked into forgotten files. One investigator's notebook contains a scrawled line, hastily crossed out. Doctor's notes rumored. Ledger never recovered. Another file holds the Fletcher petition, its ink faded with a large red stamp across the top. Dismissed. These fragments are all that remain of an attempt that might have changed the story, had it not been smothered by reputation and records. By the end of 1866, the Hollises stood taller than ever, their estate enlarged, their name polished in newspapers as a symbol of Missouri's survival. Yet beneath that triumph lay the hollowness of graves without markers, voices without echoes. The war had promised cleansing fire. Instead, it had hardened the silence. The county marched into Reconstruction with the same old families at its helm, and the same old secrets locked beneath their barns. By the early years of Reconstruction, the Hollis family had not only weathered the upheaval of war but turned it to their advantage. Elias Hollis, once a mere land baron, emerged as a political figure. He secured a seat on the county commission, his name appearing beside initiatives to rebuild schools and repair bridges destroyed by Confederate raiders. His eldest son, Thaddeus, leveraged the estate's grain reserves to secure contracts with federal agents supplying rations to freedmen's camps. In public view, the Hollis name became synonymous with stability, prosperity, and progress, an image carefully cultivated at every turn. The war's chaos had left many neighbors broken, their farms ruined by raids or foreclosure. Hollis stepped forward as benefactor, buying land at auction, extending loans to desperate families, and employing widows in his kitchens. But the generosity came at a price. Those who accepted his aid rarely questioned him afterward, their dependence woven into the fabric of daily survival. The contrast was sharp, visible benevolence above ground, whispered terror below, where the memory of vanishings and Monroe's absence still lingered like an infection the county could not quite cure. Political connections tightened the family's grip. When federal Reconstruction agents arrived to investigate abuses against freedmen and poor tenants, Elias offered guided tours of his estate, complete with visits to tidy quarters where smiling workers performed rehearsed greetings. Overseers stood in the background, their presence silent but unmistakable. No cellar doors were shown, no questions pressed too far. Reports filed after these visits praised Hollis as a model of enlightened land stewardship, a phrase that reappeared in newspapers across Missouri. Meanwhile, those who remembered differently, the Pike family, the Fletchers, the dwindling few who still muttered of Monroe, found themselves further marginalized. Requests for renewed inquiry were ignored, dismissed as attempts to tarnish the reputation of a man now entrenched in county leadership. Some sold their remaining plots and left the state altogether. Others stayed but learned to hold their tongues, speaking their fears only in kitchens at night, voices lowered to keep children from hearing. It was during this time that the Hollis wealth began to reshape the very institutions meant to provide oversight. Contributions to churches bought glowing sermons about Christian charity. Donations to schools ensured Hollis sons sat on their boards. Even the county archive, tasked with preserving records of petitions and hearings, accepted a Hollis endowment to build a new wing, conveniently timed with the disappearance of certain wartime files. When researchers decades later tried to trace the original Fletcher petition, they found only a notation that it had been misplaced during reorganization. Artifacts from this period tell two conflicting stories. In the courthouse vault rests a ceremonial key, presented to Elias Hollis for services to the county. In the same archive, tucked in the margin of an anonymous diary, a desperate note appears. We see the barn still. We know what lies beneath, but the world calls him good. These scraps reveal the fracture between official record and lived memory, a fracture widened by each year of Hollis influence. By the late 1860s, the Hollises had become untouchable not only through wealth but through the architecture of respectability. Their name adorned civic projects, their portraits hung in schools, their words echoed in editorials. To speak against them was to speak against the county itself, against the very fabric of Reconstruction's promise. In this way, power was consolidated, history rewritten, and silence enforced not by threat of violence alone, but by the far subtler weight of gratitude and dependence. It was a triumph of erasure masquerading as renewal. And with each brick laid in schools and each hymn sung in churches, the ground beneath the Hollis barns grew colder, more silent and more secure in its secrets. By the turn of the 20th century, the old war had receded into the realm of monuments and anniversaries. Missouri counties held reunions where gray-bearded veterans swapped tales, and schoolchildren recited verses about sacrifice and unity. The Hollis estate, now passed into the hands of Thaddeus Hollis and his sons, remained a centerpiece of local pride. Visitors saw manicured lawns, well-stocked barns, and a great house expanded with brick wings. To outsiders, it was a testament to perseverance. But beneath that cultivated veneer, the old whispers had not died. They had merely shifted into the mouths of a younger generation, who had never seen the cellar doors but had inherited the weight of silence. It began with casual questions. Children of tenant families asked why their grandparents grew uneasy at the mention of the Hollis name. A schoolteacher, compiling a local history project, discovered gaps in the county's wartime records, petitions missing, testimony absent, entire years condensed into bland summaries. She wrote in her notes, "Too clean. The war left scars everywhere, yet here, none are recorded." Her observation, passed to a colleague, sowed the first seeds of unease in decades. The contrast between public memory and private rumor grew sharper with the emergence of relics. In 1903, a workman repairing the foundation of an outbuilding on the Hollis estate unearthed a rusted iron shackle, its hinge still intact. The discovery was quietly confiscated by overseers. But not before he told his brother, who told his pastor. Soon, fragments of the story began to circulate again. The vanished children, the missing doctor, the barns sealed against prying eyes. For families who had carried fragments of memory in silence, the relic was confirmation that their parents' whispers had not been mere inventions. Other artifacts surfaced in unexpected places. In the attic of a boarding house in St. Louis, a trunk of old papers was found belonging to a long-dead clerk. Among receipts and journals was a copy of the Fletcher petition, thought lost forever. Though water-damaged and brittle, it still bore the signatures of those who had once pleaded for an investigation. The trunk passed into the hands of a local historian, who recognized its significance, but found little appetite among county officials to revisit old wounds. Still, copies were made, and the document began to circulate quietly among academics and reformers. The Hollises, sensing danger, responded as they always had, with pageantry and generosity. They sponsored a new courthouse clock, paid for a memorial to Union dead, and endowed a scholarship for promising students. Local newspapers praised their long-standing devotion to civic duty, bearing rumors beneath headlines of philanthropy. Yet the very need for such gestures revealed a growing anxiety. Power, once absolute, now required reinforcement. Meanwhile, descendants of those who had vanished spoke more openly than their elders. The grandchildren of Pike and Fletcher began to question why their families' names had been erased from official accounts, why no graves marked the resting places of their kin. Some traveled to St. Louis or Kansas City, where they found sympathetic ears among reform-minded journalists, eager to expose forgotten injustices. Articles appeared in small presses, hinting at unanswered mysteries surrounding the Hollis name. The county's response was defensive, even hostile. At town meetings, officials denounced the stories as slander. Pastors preached sermons about the dangers of digging up the past. Yet for the first time, silence was no longer uniform. There was division, tension, an unhealed wound reopening after decades of denial. Artifacts, whispers, and the persistence of descendants combined to fracture the illusion of innocence that had protected the Hollises for generations. Though no raid came, no courtroom inquiry reopened, the shadows lengthened. The estate remained intact, but its reputation began to fray at the edges, caught between the polished narrative of prosperity and the darker story, surfacing from beneath. The early 20th century, then, marked the beginning of an uneasy reckoning, not a collapse, but a slow leak in the dam of silence. For the first time in half a century, the question was being asked aloud. What truly lay beneath the Hollis barns? By the summer of 1912, the quiet pressure of rumor and relic reached a breaking point. The Hollis estate, long regarded as untouchable, became the focus of agitation when a small band of reformers, local descendants of the vanished, aided by journalists from St. Louis, announced their intention to excavate near the oldest barn. They argued that the county's silence was no longer sustainable, that truth, however grim, must be unearthed. Flyers appeared in town squares. Let the dead speak. Justice delayed is justice denied. For the first time in living memory, the Hollis name was publicly challenged. The confrontation that followed was not fought in courtrooms but in fields, beneath the blistering sun. On a July morning, wagons rolled up the dusty lane toward the estate, carrying farmers, widows, and reporters clutching notebooks. Among them was Henry Fletcher, grandson of the petitioner, whose voice had been silenced half a century earlier. He held a copy of the rediscovered petition in his hand, treating it like scripture. His presence alone embodied the contrast between past erasure and present defiance. The Hollises were ready. Thaddeus Hollis and his sons met the crowd at the gates, flanked by deputies and hired overseers. They spoke of trespass, of slander, of attempts to defile the memory of a family that had given more to this county than any other. Their words were polished, rehearsed, and amplified by the sheriff, who declared that no unauthorized digging would be permitted. Yet the crowd pressed forward, their voices louder than the practiced denials. Some demanded the cellar doors be opened, others called for federal investigators. What happened next has been preserved in conflicting accounts, each shaded by the teller's loyalties. One newspaper described the confrontation as a riot incited by agitators. Another, sympathetic to reformers, wrote of a peaceful gathering met with threats. Witnesses recalled that as shovels struck earth, near the barn's foundation, overseers pushed them back, shouting curses. The scuffle that followed left several bloodied, but no fatalities. Still, the violence, however limited, was enough to bring the event to national attention. Headlines in St. Louis, and even Chicago, spoke of the Hollis affair, framing it as a clash between tradition and accountability. Heritage and hidden crime. Artifacts from that day survive. A fragment of wood, said to be pried from the barn's outer wall, is preserved in a small historical society, marked with ink. Taken July 17, 1912. Another archive rests a reporter's notebook with a line hastily scrawled, "Floorboards nailed fresh, why of century old." These scraps, though circumstantial, became symbols for those convinced that the estate harbored more than grain and livestock. The aftermath revealed the full power of institutional failure. The county court quickly declared the incident unlawful and fined several participants for trespassing. The sheriff issued a statement praising the Hollis family for their restraint under provocation. Yet, among the crowd that day, restraint was not the memory that lingered. It was the sound of shovels scraping stone before being wrenched away, the smell of dust rising from ground that felt too eager to hide its contents. The confrontation did not produce bodies, nor did it topple the Hollises from their pedestal, but it cracked the illusion of permanence. For the first time, the family's power had been contested in daylight, before witnesses and reporters. Their aura of invincibility dimmed, replaced by the unmistakable odor of suspicion. Even those who had defended them in sermons and editorials admitted privately that the barns, once symbols of bounty, now looked like monuments to secrets too dangerous to expose. The contrast had become undeniable. The Hollises, clothed in respectability, standing on land that others believed was heavy with unmarked graves. And while the authorities sealed the incident with fines and denials, the public imagination was no longer so easily controlled. The Hollis name, once synonymous with prosperity, now carried the shadow of hollow graves more openly than ever before. Time eventually did what confrontation and petition could not. It dulled the edges of outrage, and folded the Hollis story into the broader silence of history. By the 1930s, the barns still stood, their beams weathered gray, their foundations sunk deeper into the earth. The estate remained occupied, though its fortunes declined with each passing generation. The attempted excavation of 1912 lived on only in newspaper clippings, yellowed and brittle, read by few and remembered by fewer, and yet the question refused to vanish. It lingered in back rooms, in classrooms, in the half-finished sentences of old men who leaned on canes outside the courthouse. The contrast by then was almost unbearable. The county presented itself as modern, industrious, moving into the future with paved roads and electric lights, while beneath its most storied property lay the suspicion of graves unmarked, voices unacknowledged. Children played near the barns, laughing where others may have once cried. Couples married in the courthouse funded by Hollis wealth, their vows echoing. In halls where petitions had been stamped, dismissed, progress rose, but it stood on foundations that had never been cleared of their shadows. Philosophers speak of the difference between history and memory. History is what is written, codified, preserved in ledgers and textbooks. Memory is what refuses to be erased, what passes by whisper, by scar, by the gaze of a grandmother when the Hollis name is spoken. In Missouri, the Hollises owned history. Their donations, their buildings, their portraits secured their place, but memory belonged to the dispossessed, to those whose kin vanished into silence. That memory never allowed the ground beneath the barns to rest easy. What is the cost of silence? For the Hollises, it was the curse of legacy. Wealth that could not be untangled from suspicion. Prosperity forever shadowed by the rumor of graves. For the county, it was complicity. Institutions that chose order over truth, reputation over justice. And for those who lost, Monroe, the children, the vanished tenants, it was the theft not only of life but of remembrance. Their stories, stripped from records, survive only in fragments, artifacts, and whispers. There are those who still argue that no proof was ever produced, that all is rumor layered upon rumor, and there are others who insist that the absence of proof was itself the proof, that ledgers vanish, petitions burn, barns are guarded for reasons that go beyond grain. Between these two poles, the story remains suspended, not resolved but endlessly debated, its very uncertainty a wound that refuses to close. The ethical demand is plain: to remember without inventing, to honor without embellishment, to speak aloud even when silence has been taught for generations. The story of the Hollis estate is less about whether graves lie beneath its barns than about the choices a community makes when faced with the unbearable. Do we turn away? Do we build schools and churches atop the silence and call it progress? Or do we pause long enough to hear what memory still insists upon? That justice buried is not justice denied but justice deferred, awaiting those with the courage to unearth it? The barns still stand, though their roofs sag. The Hollis name still marks a street in the county seat. Tourists drive past without pausing, unaware of the whispers that trail the soil. Yet those who know, those who remember, carry the weight of a question that has never been answered. It is the question that ends this story and begins another. When silence protects the powerful and buries the powerless, what does it say about the kind of future we are willing to build? That question, perhaps more than any artifact or document, is the true legacy of the Hollis name. And now it passes to you.